Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. My name is Richard Sverrisson. I'm joined today by my colleague Gert of Mollestad, who covers the Nordic region for Montel. And we are joined by Marius Holm Rennesund, analyst and partner at Thema, an Oslo-based consultancy. A warm welcome to you, Marius.
Thank you.
And welcome to you, Gert.
Thank you.
Today we're taking a close look at the outbreak of protests against onshore wind in Norway. So, where are the current protests and what are they protesting against, Marius?
Well, the most important part or the most vocal protests are around the NO3 area in the mid-Norway. Trønder Energy has a very large project. It's the Northern Europe's largest project with around 1,000 megawatts of installed capacity. But it's basically only one part of that project where you see protests.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a small island called Frøya.
That's off Trondheim. It's kind of mid-Norway, is it?
Yeah, it's mid-Norway.
For those who aren't familiar with the NO3 zone.
Exactly. But I think it's growing across Norway right now, the protests. We see it becoming more and more vocal. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of natural. It's first of the last 2 years that you really see wind developments in Norway.
Mm.
You've seen
onshore.
It onshore. Mm. You've seen it in Sweden for quite some while without much protests. But in Norway, it's now you've started to actually build, and when people actually see the windmills, they start to protest against them.
Absolutely. I mean, we'll come back to comparisons with neighbouring countries a bit later. But what is it exactly they're protesting against? Do you think that you'd think clean green energy that would be welcomed?
Yeah. Well, it's basically a not in my backyard problem. Yeah. It's in a way climate versus local environmental impact, and it's both in terms of the road construction and how it hurts the local environment. Birds is important. Many don't want to see their windmill from their cabin or their house. So that's also a part of it. So I think it's kind of mixed, specifically in this project. If you look at kind of the big lines there, it's more climate versus local environmental impact.
So the main reason is the impact on wildlife and not just visual.
Not just visual, but building roads around very vulnerable areas that some feel these areas are, especially along the coast where it's very visible. It's important for the protesters.
And they also built kind of high in the landscape. So you will be able to see them from kind of very long distances.
It kind of makes sense because you want them to be built where it's windy.
Precisely.
And there's not windy in the valleys. It's up at the top.
Precisely. And it also triggers a lot of construction work. You have to build roads and you have to kind of use a lot of dynamite and heavy construction work for the roads. So you will. The claim is that this will be irreversible local impacts to build the windmills.
But that's only in the initial phase, surely. Once the roads are there, the impact will be less, or?
Well, they're still visible, but I think there's two different ways of seeing it. Of course, they will still be there. There will still be some kind of local damage to the area. While some reports also say that tourism increases, the areas will be used more by people who want to experience wildlife as well. So it's a kind of a mixed picture there. But of course, in these open landscapes, it's easier to see the roads, it's easier to see the windmills than in typical wooden areas, where I think the visual impact, at least, is less with the road construction.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been in Stord, and they have, is it the Fitjar power company there? They have onshore wind. I mean, I'm just wondering why are the protests happening now? Because there have been, I mean, onshore wind in parts, maybe isolated parts of Norway. I'm just wondering why,
No, I think it's now where the big development is happening. The plans has been there. They got their licenses, and in that licensing process, that's really when you should have protested against it. People haven't done that. It wasn't expected that they would come so many projects and so early, I guess, for some. We've seen a rapid cost decrease. That means that more projects are now profitable, even without L certificates. That means more projects coming online.
Without subsidies?
Without subsidies, yeah. So it's now that you actually see the visual impact. And if you use Fosen as an example again, the first wind parks there are now up and running. So you actually see the physical impact from them. And it's the latter ones in that large project that the protests are happening.
But do you think that the rising resistance towards onshore wind power in Norway could actually result in a stop in new developments or new projects?
I don't think we will see a stop, but I think, well, up until now, most projects have been realized by a project developer and then sold to a foreign financial company and often backed with a PPA with a consumer. And what we expect and have seen the start of now is that more of the regional utilities that hasn't been investing in wind power have now started to look at new projects and are now allowed by their owner to actually invest in wind, which they haven't for some years. And that process might be not reversed, but we might not see that many local utilities being willing to invest in onshore wind when the protests are so large. And the reputational risk increases. I just saw an interview with Ståle Gjersvold, the chief of Trønder Energi, which own this or are building this wind park where the protests are most vocal. And he's stating that the public opinion about Trønder Energi now might be changing, and that's the challenge for them.
Have these protests taken the companies such as Trønder Energi, have they taken them by surprise?
Well, it seems it has. I'm not sure they should be that surprised. I mean, things have been running smoothly for a while, but it's now that you actually see the projects, and you should expect at least some resistance towards it.
Good point that you made there, that it's only when they're actually building them that the protests emerge rather than in the licensing phase, which to some would be slightly odd, you know.
Yeah, it is odd, and they should have started working against it if you are against it at an earlier stage, but I don't think they really realize the impact it would have. And it's easier when it's more concrete and you actually see what's happening to be more vocal and you know, the protests have now delayed the construction work for quite some time as well, so it's also cost Trønder Energi quite a lot of money these days.
So it's the Norwegian Don Quixote, if you like, fighting against these windmills.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just wondering if we're able to compare the protests that are happening now to what's happened against the expansion of hydro plants in the 1970s and 80s. Is that a fair comparison, Marius?
I think that's a bit early to say. We've really now only have this one area where the protest has been very vocal, but it's now growing across Norway, and we see that new projects are opposed as well. I mean, I'm a bit too young to have experienced.
Well, so we as well, Marius, of course.
The large protests in the 70s, but I feel that some of them were even harder and more debated than what we see right now. Although the wind power debate has been quite heated over the last few weeks, actually. So it remains to be seen whether they continue and whether you can compare it when you look back a few years ahead to what you saw with regards to hydro in the 70s and 80s. But it's you know, every project that has an environmental impact will be opposed by some, and not in my backyard problem will also be there. Whatever you do, whatever you build, so of course there will be protests both against new hydro build-outs as well in Norway, as well as wind power.
Absolutely, I think that's part of being living in a democracy in a way that everyone has to have their voice. But do you think politicians, both local and national, are listening to the protesters? Are they taking any notice?
I think they definitely are, especially at the national level. We have had the yearly meetings in a number of political parties over the last few weeks. And we see many of them are now more actively supporting offshore wind power and said that we should build some onshore, but offshore should be the focus going forward. And that has been a large change. And And with the cost numbers you now see for offshore, that means they also will need to be willing to support them financially if they are to be built.
Absolutely. We'll come back to offshore, I think, later in this pod. But is there a split between left and right in terms of the sort of anti-wind, or is it just spread across the political spectrum? I mean,
I would say it's spread quite across because you've seen the resistance both in the left-wing party and all to the right-wing party, and in the large conservative party there were some suggestions for complete stop of onshore wind. That didn't get us a vote, but there is a clear opposition in all parties across the board, I would say.
So it's not a clear political split on this. There's just there's opposition and support within maybe all parties.
Yes, I would say so.
Do you expect these kind of protests to happen more and more, to become more widespread across Norway? I mean, they've been focused very much now in mid-Norway in the Trøndelag and near Trondheim.
Yeah, I would expect that we'll see it across the country. We've seen that a lot of these national organizations are active in this space, and you will see that spread across the country. And I think it's one important aspect that we haven't discussed is that this coincides with when the Norwegian regulator actually published their plan for where you can build onshore wind, and where they picked 13 different geographical areas where they think it's right to build wind, where there's grid, there's suitable landscape, etc. And I think we're gonna see protests all across those areas. And this plan is out on a hearing process now, and I think it's going to be a lot of focus on that hearing process, and eventually when they revise the plan after the hearing process, what the results there will be.
Which 13 areas did they kind of isolate or?
Well, it's spread all across Norway basically.
Okay.
So hence you will probably also see protests all across Norway.
Exactly. Yeah.
Maybe surprisingly little in northern Norway actually, where the wind resource is absolutely best, but there you have wind farms producing like 4,200 hours a year. So, but the grid there is a serious constraint. So that was one of the reasons that I kind of pushed a lot of the areas towards southern Norway, because there you are closer to the interconnectors and also with a stronger grid. So.
And closer to demand centres as well, I suppose. There's not so much demand maybe in the north.
But then again, there you have a denser population, so it's it's going to be tricky.
Yeah, absolutely.
To the next question, where you have Sweden, which is very sparsely populated, especially in the north. Yeah. So do you think you could see a shift that you won't have so much wind power in Norway, and then that the projects are coming in Sweden instead?
Yeah, I mean that could be a possible result, definitely. Still, the resource base is better in Norway, but with the technology development you've had over the last few years, you see that you can produce more also in more wooden areas, which is what you have in Sweden. And many, I think, also feels that the impact is smaller in wooden areas. You still see the windmills; they need to be very
areas of
high.
Forests and
So that also might lead to it being more or less unpopular, to put it that way, to build in those areas.
So you build it above the tree line, or okay. So visually, it's maybe not so challenging, maybe for some. Yeah.
No, I would say so. And you see also in Norway, and especially along the border towards Sweden, some wind farms in more forest areas. And at least when I look at them, the visual impact seems less.
Okay. We at Montel, we want to look at the market impact of this. What does the expansion of wind do to market prices, and what's your outlook for the coming years as wind capacity grows in the region?
No, I mean, it definitely puts a downward pressure on prices. The more you build, the more supply you would have for basically the same demand, and that would push prices down. But there are some other effects as well. I mean, the lower power price might lead to some increases in demand as well. And
have you got any numbers here, Marius, you can throw around?
No, yeah. I mean, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly how much wind farm would push prices down. What we see is in the medium term, power prices will still much be driven by gas, coal, and CO2 prices. But we will see a switch from the short-run marginal cost of coal being the most important to more short-run marginal cost of gas. And that's more because of the development elsewhere in Europe, where you phase out coal and you need to use more gas in the power production.
Yeah, we're seeing more and more fuel switching occurring in continental Europe.
Definitely. So that effect, I think we will see, up until 2025, something like that, in the medium term. In the long term, I think it's really the long run or the investment cost for new wind that will kind of set a soft cap on power prices. I think we and most others have been taken by surprise of the rapid cost decrease for wind over the past 8 years or so. I think it will flatten out over time, but still it's difficult to see power prices over consecutive years at a much higher level than what the long-run marginal cost of a new wind farm will be.
And what is that?
Well,
I suppose it varies, but of course the answer depends. Is the answer,
yeah. But if you look at NVE's number, for example, they have the cost now at slightly below 40 euros, between 35 and 40. So I think we're going to slide down maybe towards the 35 euro level
per megawatt hour.
Megawatt hour. When that is said, I think you can still see a system price above that, and that's a reason for that, and that's what you often call the cannibalization effect. That a wind farm doesn't receive that average price over the year, because you have to produce when the wind is blowing, and then everybody else has to produce as well, and that pushes prices down. So the capture price, the price that the wind farm actually receives, will be lower than the average price when it produces money.
And we did have an example Sunday this week when you have high snowmelt now seasonally in Norway and Sweden, and then there was quite a windy day. So on Sunday the area prices in Sweden fell to only 12 euros, just below 12 euros. So you get this short-term price drops when the wind is blowing, and especially combined with heavy inflow from melting snow.
Yeah, and that's the other factor we might see, more volatile prices. You will go very low when there's good precipitation and a lot of wind, and then you probably will go higher. At least in our view, we expect some higher gas prices. CO2 prices are high, but might increase in the long run at least. And then you get prices down, towards zero when it's windy, and then you can get very high prices in those hours where there's less wind.
Sure, but I think given that kind of low price scenario, or the increased likelihood that this will happen with more wind expansion and more wind capacity being built, what are developers pricing this in? I mean, this is quite a low price. There's a high risk of very low prices.
Yeah, I think they are. At least we've seen a focus now where they are much more preoccupied with the cannibalization effect. We have a number of clients where we run sensitivities on the cannibalization and in different price areas, because it will vary between areas because you have more or less wind, but also because the interconnections to other areas is good or bad, or it's high or low. So I think investors more and more are looking into this, definitely. On the other hand, most of the wind farms that's been realized over the past few years have been backed with a PPA. So basically the investor has secured a fixed power price. So in negotiating this PPA, they should have taken that into consideration, but that's nothing we see whether they do or not. So.
Absolutely. Is this cannibalization effect, is that a reason why some Nordic hydropower producers haven't invested in onshore wind?
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason, and for them, all investments in new production capacity means lower prices for their existing assets. So I think that's been why they've been reluctant, at least up until now, to invest in wind. With, I think, the effect that they haven't really expected that somebody else, actually the foreign funds, came in and took that market. So you will get lower power prices still, and you're not part of the game because you haven't done any investments, and that's why I see more of the regional utilities now might be willing to do investments in onshore wind.
Potentially with a PPA as well.
Potentially with a PPA, but in general, utilities, both Nordic and also the foreign utilities that has invested in onshore wind in Norway or Sweden, are better with handling power price risk, and that's what they made for a living, right? So
that's their bread and butter. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so they rather trade that volume than do PPA.
The question is, there's a lot of potential for the Norwegian hydropower still, especially when expanding the existing power plants. So, and according to NTNU Professor Leif Lian, there's a potential of 22 to 30 terawatt hours in existing Norwegian hydropower plants. So could it be an easier solution to focus the investments towards hydropower instead of building wind power?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is existing projects that you are rebuilding or refurbishing and do minor changes to them, leading to a much more capacity. And of course, that's environmental-wise, that's a sound thing to do. So you might see that happening going forward. But I think what others have pinpointed, and maybe the author of this report as well, is the tax incentives with this respect. And the way the tax regime is right now, it's not worthwhile doing those rebuilds. But of course, from the political side, they might be more willing to do changes to these tax regimes now when the opposition towards onshore wind is so large. So there might be a change there, and in many respects it makes sense to do so.
Yeah, and there's a kind of a small committee looking at the tax system for hydropower and also wind power in Norway, led by the former head of a regulator, NBI. He's called Per Sandrud, and he is supposed to deliver his report in October this year. And
so maybe we'll come back in October and discuss this again with you, Marius.
And I picked up kind of clear signals from different political parties that there has to be a makeover over the tax system to be able to trigger the hydropower refurbishment in Norway.
And that's one side of it. The other side is the tax paid by onshore wind, where you have no resource rent tax as you have for hydropower.
So it's a bit unfair. It's not exactly a level playing field.
Not by a long shot. No.
Okay. That may have made sense when you needed to financially support with subsidies new onshore wind, but when it's profitable, I think you might see a change also there. And even the wind power organization in Norway, Norway, is suggesting to have a resource rent tax on wind power as well.
Okay, yeah.
And that
interesting.
It's also to change the public opinion, probably. I mean, if you give more back to your local community where the wind farm is built, they might be more positive.
For sure. Do you think this kind of modernization of Norwegian hydropower might lead to protests as well? Because you're also changing the plants, aren't you? Or is it?
The impact is rather limited because you're using the same dam. Maybe expanding it a bit, but there's no new nature that's sacrificed.
Okay, so it's within the plant itself that you're making changes to the infrastructure.
You're not damming down a new river. It's kind of using the same resources before.
Fair enough. How about the potential for offshore wind? I mean, you touched upon it earlier, Marius, and because obviously some parts of Norway, as we know, are very, very windy. So what's the potential here?
There's not many reports looking at the full potential, and so that remains to be seen. It's large, definitely. Again, it depends on which areas you would like to open for offshore wind. I think the other challenge along the Norwegian coast is that it's deep. And most of the offshore wind we see today is fixed to the bottom, which you can't do in many places around Norway. So floating wind is what you would look at. And the cost for that right now is higher than for fixed bottom fixed wind.
Can you give some numbers here, some certain ballpark figure?
I think, well,
is it twice the cost? Or?
Yeah,
okay,
almost twice the cost, at least 30-40% more. So it depends. Again, offshore wind is a more immature technology. Floating is even more immature. So you would expect cost decreases. But how much, how fast is the big question. But then again, if Norwegian authorities are willing to subsidize because they rather would like to build offshore than onshore,
it's all about the finance minister. How deep are the pockets of the finance minister? Exactly.
Quite
absolutely.
deep.
And I think also some of the Norwegian utilities might think that, with the protest we see now, let's skip that step and go directly to offshore.
But it's worth mentioning that Statkraft has been clearly against subsidizing offshore wind in Norway. They don't want to use taxpayers' money with the result of even lower power prices in Norway. So you would, from an economic standpoint, it seems not very wise.
Well, continuing the discussion about subsidies, can these be built subsidy-free? And what's the outlook for, you mentioned the certificate, the electricity certificate market in the Nordic region. What's the outlook here post-2020, Marius? Could you give us some of your views?
Yeah, I mean, with the current regime that's been proposed, the outlook is not very good. We're looking at more or less zero prices, or at least very low prices from the early 20s.
For LSATs.
So that won't give any support either to onshore or offshore. So you need to do changes either to that system or more likely other support mechanisms to get offshore wind going, both in Norway and there are projects also in Sweden. Already now you see in some markets that they have at least implicit subsidies because they get free grid connections, etc. And that's what we're seeing around Europe, is that in auctions they bid in zero subsidy or a zero add-on to the power price, and that's because they get some implicit subsidies in this. That's at least one part of it. The other part is that it is often 5, 6, 7 years ahead until they need to build it, and the punishment for not building is not very severe. So it's basically a bet on high power prices and costs coming drastically down, combined with some implicit subsidies.
To rephrase that would be to say, well, if they have low prices, low wholesale prices or market prices going forward, some of these are unlikely to be built.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We might see that.
And I talked to the head of Vattenfall a couple of months ago, and he said there will be no offshore wind farms in Sweden as long as they don't get the grid connection sponsored by
and that,
public.
of course, that's another factor, the grid connection. A fascinating discussion. Thank you very much, Marius. Thank you very much, Gert. I'm sure we'll come back to this and we'll invite you again on the Montel pod, Marius. So that's about all for now. Next week I'll be podding live from the Euroelectric conference in Florence. But please keep up to date with all our stories on Montel News. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and Spotify. Thank you. Goodbye.